So the radiation frame. What is the radiation frame? So HBO released quite a nice dramatic fictionalized series about what it is that happened at Chernobyl. So you're probably thinking, oh, Judith only talks about the radiation frame because she watched the HBO series of Chernobyl, and it's the most brilliant look at institutions and structures in fictional television since The Wire. So of course she's going to apply that frame. And you got us, right? You certainly got us on that one. Got us dead to rights. That's precisely why we're doing it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong, right? But the whole thing, right, is, as we said before, we would hope that this particular round, right, and the specifics of these two particular high-profile individuals who stand accused is viewed the same way that Chernobyl was, right? Because it exposed flaws and problems in the Soviet system and its corruption in ways. Of course, it was a terrible event, and we still have no idea how many people died from it, and we'll get to that bit. But the consequences, right, were that the Soviet Union, that the party, right, that the entire apparatus could not conceal the extent of the rot and the corruption in the system, right? And it cracked something fundamental in the Soviet Union that led it directly on the path to Glasnost, the Berlin Wall coming down, that Scorpion song that the CIA probably did not write, so on and so forth, right? And here we are in the post-Cold War world. But the whole thing about radiation is that it's invisible, right? There's a part in the HBO series where there's something called the Bridge of Death, right? There are all these people lined up on a bridge that were watching the fire rage in the facility from like a few kilometers away. Everyone who stood on that bridge and watched it burn died from radiation poisoning, right? And they had no clue, right? None at all, right? And there's different people talking about their levels of exposure and what they thought they knew when, like the firefighters, the coal miners who came in, all of this, right? So different levels of knowing, different distances away, different overall consequences. But the thing is that the full scope of it was not known for a long time because there was not a lot known about radiation poisoning at the time. They were not sufficiently motivated to want to know the problems with this because even on an international scale outside of the Warsaw Pact, does the United States really want people knowing how dangerous nuclear energy could be if it means they're going to have to lose all the nuclear power plants and replace them quite quickly? No, they don't. So the incentives were fucked in terms of a desire to understand the scope of the problem. So we still don't quite know how many people died, disfigured, etc. from it. We just don't know. And probably never will, although some forensic stuff gives us a bit of a better view. So that's our point, right? Is that radiation, it's immediately invisible and it gets to you over time, right? And the closer you are to it, the worse it gets, right? And so this is what abuse and harassment does to people in the comic book industry, precisely because it can take months if we're lucky, but frequently years. And in the case of one of the most recent ones, it seems 20 years, right? Could be, right? Going back to the 1990s. And so there are people who have been infected for this entire time the public didn't know about. And of course, also the difference between the radiation and this is that new harm can be created just by the knowing of it, right? Like you cannot, hear about Chernobyl now and get radiation poisoning. No. But exclusion zones exist if you go into the exclusion zones, and so that's where it becomes a particularly useful frame, right? So let's break down the dynamics. Again, we're going to stay in the abstract. We're not going to use particular names, particular scenarios, but kind of what it is that all of them have in common, sort of irrespective of the specific types of abuse or harassment that happened, right? So you have to modulate the severity of this according to what it is that people are being accused of, have been proven to do, etc., right? So in the middle of this, it's it's the meltdown, it's the person, it's the abuser, right? So the immediate circle here, right, is of course your victims. the people who were harassed, abused, assaulted, whatever, right? So these are the people you always want to prioritize. They got it the worst, and they typically will face the most fallout, right, from this for the rest of their lives relative to everyone else. So these are the people you want front of mind. Now, the next two, they're fungible, like we said. It's non-Euclidean because who gets harmed, what, in what ways. Like, it's not Oppression Olympics, right? It's not a hierarchy. So these two are let's say, the social and professional circles of the victims and the social and professional circles of the abuser, the harasser, the groomer, the person who stands accused. Right? And so, like, this is the whole thing. When it comes to situations that involve the type of serial philandering, if you want to be generous about it, right? If you want to presume that things went down in precisely the way that the men who stand accused of it typically say that they did, everybody was consenting, we didn't know there was power that could be abused, whatever, right? Is that men in these professional circles who are sloppy about their personal lives create all kinds of wreckage in the personal and professional circles of everyone around them, right? Because if they're out there sleeping with their fans, hitting on their collaborators, getting fucking drunk and groping people at conventions, right? All of that invades the professional spaces of everyone around it, right? But let's get specific. If you were groomed, manipulated in a toxic relationship that was tied, or at least you felt was tied to specific outcomes of your career and your potential as an artist or writer or what have you, then when and if you break away, there's going to have to be someone else who, like, you're going to have friends who hopefully were able to stick with you the whole time, at the very least, if not be there at the end to help you pick up the pieces of your life and get it back on track. And that is a tremendous amount of emotional labor, sometimes physical labor, and it comes at a tremendous cost, right? So there's always these kind of caregivers who are around the typically women, but not always, people who get cast aside, right? If we're talking about 60 people over the span of 20 years, do the math. How many relationships is that going at once, right? So you create webs, sometimes you create, usually, right, because people are people, you create webs of jealousy and retaliation and all of these kinds of things between the people who you are probably setting against each other to get attention from you. Everyone's competing for your attention. Everyone's competing for your, affection, because you're entertaining 3, 4, 5, 6 lasses at a time. And the last round that you got rid of may be trying to get back in. So if you bring a new young woman into your little circle, and there's exes and scorn lovers and things hovering around the outside, you've made that person a target. You could be the best partner in the world to that one individual, but you have left so much wreckage in your personal life behind that you have opened them up to all kinds of retaliatory behavior, all kinds of bullying, all kinds of bizarre harassment that they did not account for, right? Because you cannot handle your shit, right? And so the people who work with these other creators that are in your orbit are having to absorb what is going on, whether it's like missed deadlines because somebody is so distraught over the way that you've treated them, or they end up in the hospital, or wherever the fuck it is, right? Missed deadlines, distraction, trying to comfort someone who's going through the worst time in their life, and so it spreads, right? And that's why we have the circle and why it's radiation, because you could be working with a genuinely great young lass whose career you want to support. You could be on this ring. You might not even know who it is that she's involved with, but he makes her life a living hell because either he can't handle his shite, right, or he's bullying, abusing, or manipulating her, and all of that. Now you've got to clean up after it. You've got to take care of it, because you don't want to see that young lass get tossed off to the curb. You don't want to see her left to the night, right, or the wolves or anything like that. You want to help her get her shit back together and get the career that you obviously wanted to get off the ground for her off the ground, so that she can do whatever it is with her life or their life or his life or whatever the gender of this particular victim is. But you now have to pick up the burden of all of the promises that this Svengali-like comic book creator, probably a writer, put this young lass through. Hey, ooh, we can help you a career. Oh, we can open a Rolodex. Oh, we can do all these things, right? Maybe you did a couple of them, but you know, when they're too wrecked to take advantage of those opportunities because of the wreckage that you've made of their lives, someone else now has to come in to be a genuine, real mentor and pick up that weight. And there's many of us who would love to do that and do that and have done that. But it's not fair on us that we have to be effectively the emotional maid service of your bullshit, right? You know, it's like Pepper Potts in the first Iron Man movie. She's like, oh, Tony slept with another woman, now it's my job to sweep her out, right? And it's supposed to be all funny and, oh, look how biting Pepper is at this Vanity Fair woman. But, like, that's a grotesque thing to be putting on your direct employee whose life has been intertwined with not just your professional life at the company where she has duties, but fixing your personal life. It's garbage, mama, right? And of course that movie romanticizes that entire thing because they've got that kid that cannot count past 3,000 or whatever the fuck it is. Hey, and that's the industry in a nutshell, that it's fine to be Tony Stark and to manipulate the relationships around you and do all these things, but it's not, right? And so that's what those two tiers represent, right? The people who are losing work because your behavior has finally surfaced and they can the entire project. Because that's typically what happens 9 times out of 10. It's not, oh, we'll find another writer and plug them in, right? Particularly when it's create your own stuff, but sometimes that's just what it is too, right? Because you might be writing a story about a T-Rex that's also Batman, and then they replace you with an entirely different creative team. So new writer, new artist, new letterer, so all those other guys, boom, they lost that gig. Hopefully they get another one. But you caused that that thing. So maybe it would be, you know, random idea, porn industry has kill fees, right? Maybe if you break a certain morality clause, you pay a kill fee to your creative team, particularly if you're on a create your own thing, right? But there's other companies that don't have those infrastructures, like Image. So maybe projects with abusers just keep rolling, right? Or their numbers collapse. But you don't necessarily say, okay, if your guy rating your main Spider-Man comic turns out to be a serial groomer, then you replace him with somebody else who can write Spider-Man, and the same artist, the same letter, all these people continue on and they still have jobs, right? You might be able to do something like that in some cases, but that rarely ever happens, and we cannot think of a single instance off the top of our heads when that did, because typically when these kind of things come out, it's the smaller create your own projects that get dumped, and these creative teams just do not get the bounce back. And we talked about this with another lad who had a long history. People are well aware of his history and continued to work with him, but they continued to work with him at a company that had shown up until then that it didn't give a shit, right? So even if you made a compromised moral decision to say, well, we know what is this guy's done, but we're still going to work with him anyway, but you're still in this tier if, for all intents and purposes, it looks as if the company says it's okay for you to work with him. And then if they change their minds one day, perhaps because licensees of a licensed comic or something like that don't like the optics of it and it threatens that company keeping the license, they'll dump that guy, and then you lose a steady gig that you've had for however long, right? Because it was not relevant to management until they had to pay a price for it, so you pay a much higher price than they did for it. And it's garbage, and it's one of the consequences of this. And you know, it's not such a morally clean-cut area of all of this, but it does it does bear repeating, right? Because when there are institutional failures, particularly in the case of someone who is known to have a history behind them, and then the winds change when, it was okay today, it's not okay tomorrow, right? Or it was okay yesterday, but it's not okay today, then these institutions are forcing the individuals to assume burdens that they absolutely should not, because there is not a clear corporate culture, right? So that might be one of the things that unionizing ameliorates, right? So that it's harder to just say, okay, we've booted this guy off this book, and we're not going to give you other options, right? So kill fees, unions, right? There's always something to do. But then the furthest outer ring, we'll bring the chart back one last time for this, even though we're sure that it doesn't quite matter what the exact geography is. But the outer ring, like you can play with this in a few different ways. It could be retailers that are now losing the sales and can't move the back issues off the shite that you did that nobody wants to touch because it's now become radioactive, right? That's certainly a thing. There's probably back issues of a few different titles that you could imagine the names of if you remember the histories of these things, that just aren't going to move. They get pulped, they get burned, and they're non-returnable, right? Wouldn't that be lovely if in the new distributor contracts, particularly the new distributors that DC is signing with, that retailers got garbage man insurance, where it's like, well, if a book gets cancelled because someone on the creative team turns out to be an abuser, harasser, or a groomer, then all of your issues are fully returnable for a 100% money back guarantee. Again, we're on the outer edge of the periphery. This is the least serious repercussion of all of this. But that said, if a major creator who has had several hits at Vertigo, DC, Marvel, Image, etc., has a back catalogue that sells quite well in trade, and is in fact a writer who at one point in their career said that nobody sells more trade paperbacks than them. If their back catalogue that moves quite perennially well fucking tanks in value, right, because the rumors and the allegations and the disclosures hit the tidal wave to the part that everybody knows, not just a small individual bubble, but once it becomes known, once it breaks wide, if their back catalog collapses in value, then you've got an entire shelf at a comic book store that's turned to shite overnight. And the store that we go to here, it organizes itself like that. It's got a big Alan Moore shelf. It's got a big Brian Bendis shelf. It's got a big Grant Morrison shelf, right? So when one of the guys with his own shelf gets outed as this, you ask yourself, what's the culture of a shop, right? Do we want to keep dedicating an entire shelf to this guy? If you say no, you're going to have to pull that shelf and everything on it, and you might sprinkle it into the library alphabetically with everything else. But those books are not going to move the same way that they did if you unface them, if you take them out of that place of prominence. And if everybody knows that happened, they're not going to buy them. They're just going to sit there on the shelf, and they're not going to move, and you've lost that investment. And the direct market, like we said, is quite precarious at the moment. As we mentioned in the prior segment, there were colleagues of someone who had multiple disclosures about them that either had tested positive or were struggling quite symptomatically with the coronavirus at the time that those disclosures happened. This is not a time for people in the industry, for comic book stores in the industry, to have significant perennial back catalogs crumble to shite on them. So, like, this is it. These are the massive, massive repercussions. But also, like, The fans who invest in personalities, in careers, in the values that these people say that they have, it all becomes null and void. And everyone, at every stage, no matter if the Geiger counter is going, or, right? There's a tremendous loss of faith, loss of trust. It can be very difficult to get back, right? And it's not necessarily, and we don't mean by getting back by the person who breached it, the abuser, the harasser, the groomer, whatever it is that they did. We're not talking about that person, regaining that trust. We're talking about the readers, the retailers, the colleagues, being able to trust anybody else again. To be able to find it in themselves, to allow themselves the vulnerability to be moved by the art, right? Because it can be very difficult to disentangle those two things. Because if you allow yourself the vulnerability to be moved by the art, then you almost certainly have in some way been moved by the artist. We talk about the death of the author, right? And all of these things, which is a fine thing to talk about in the abstract as theory. But in practice, it is perhaps just as hard, or maybe even harder, than fuck someone and don't catch feelings, right? Or do it once a month for 6 years. Right, every Wednesday for 6 years when a new issue comes out, right? And you have that long-term openness and vulnerability, that scheduled hookup, and you can call it friends with benefits, but things accumulate, right? And so how do you steel yourself? How do you open yourself to be vulnerable, to be moved by the art, while closing yourself from being moved by the artist? How do you do that, right? How do you maintain such a strong degree of separation when you don't know yet? Right, it's been quite a long time since Holy Terror, so if Frank Miller's xenophobic, racist train wreck of a comic that Bob Schreck published as his first thing at Legendary, if that turned you off from him, then you've had, what is it now, like roughly 20 years to sort out how it is you feel about Batman Year One and David Mazzucchelli's art, or Daredevil, or The Dark Knight Returns, Sin City. You've had time to steel yourself, or perhaps you're a youngin' and you came in knowing this. You didn't quite know who Frank Miller was, or you hadn't engaged with his work before he did that xenophobic pile of garbage, right? So you could steel yourself and say, well, we're just not going to read Sin City because we don't want to read comics from people like that. Or you can say, we're going to read this knowing that we have to put an emotional wall between the way that this art speaks to us and the way that the artist might have spoken to us other ways, right? And that's why we talked the way that we did about J.K. Rowling in the other videos, right? Because if you're in kidlit, reaching children, they're not even at a stage to start conceptualizing all of that. Harry Potter may as well be J.K. Rowling himself, right? Katniss Everdeen might as well be Suzanne Collins when you're like 12, 13 years old. And so, if someone who has done all of these things, if someone stands accused of harassment, abuse, grooming, shall we say, particularly if some of the accusers were underage when it started, then you can start to see the dangerous entanglements if that same person worked on a very popular superhero whose main readership is tween and teen girls, or perhaps college age. So you understand, right, that when we talk about the vulnerability of opening yourself to the art, and the vulnerability of opening yourself to the artist, and the way that they cross channel and they're difficult to damn, right? They're difficult to bridge. When you're that much younger, it's that much harder, right?